All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Varun Soni, and I'm the Dean of Religious Life at USC. I'm really very grateful for everyone who's come today, especially given that it's the Laker game. Tonight's special event is entitled Creating Dialogue, Radicalization, Law Enforcement, and Civil Rights. And before we begin, I'd like to formally thank the many sponsoring groups that made this evening possible. Specifically, the Office of Religious Life, the Asian Pacific American Student Services, the National Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, or CREATE, at SPPD, the Muslim Student Union, Ansar Service Partnership, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, the Center on Public Diplomacy at Annenberg, and the Knight Chair in Media and Religion at Annenberg. The idea for this event started with our Muslim students who have been concerned about the growing public Islamophobia in the U.S. over the last year, starting with the Park 51 controversy and extending to the politicization of Sharia law as an election issue, the ongoing opposition to mosques around the country, and most recently the congressional hearings regarding Muslim radicalization in the U.S. And this has resulted in a disturbing trend that for many people in the U.S., it seems as though hating Islam is becoming patriotic. But the issues that Muslim Americans confronted this year are not just Muslim issues. Rather, they are American issues that deeply implicate constitutional concerns of religious freedom, due process, and equal protection. I have found that USC is a unique location for reconciliation and engagement, and I'm honored to be at a university that cares so much about community collaboration and engagement, especially with the Muslim community. Here at USC, we house the American Muslim Civic Leadership Institute and the Center for Muslim and Jewish Engagement, and we work regularly with our partners in the local Muslim community, such as the Islamic Center of Southern California, the Omar Ibn Al-Khattab Foundation and Mosque, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and the Hassan Hutut Legacy Foundation. Several years ago, we hosted a roundtable discussion between Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff and Muslim and Sikh student leaders, discussing how the Department of Homeland Security could work closely with Muslim and Sikh communities. And next year, USC will be hosting a conference with the Islamic Society of North America focused on Muslim peacemaking and conflict resolution. And of course, today we're honored to host LA Sheriff Lee Baca, who was the only law enforcement officer to testify at recent congressional hearings. And listening to his words at the hearings, I'm sure many of you felt as I did, proud to be an Angelino, and so grateful for our sheriff's leadership, vision, and courage. So we have an extraordinary panel of speakers today, an all-star lineup of scholars and policymakers that really brings together the strengths of our university and of our city. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce the moderator who will introduce the event and the panelists. The moderator for this evening's event is Ali Mir, the Director of Muslim Student Life at USC. Under his leadership, Muslim life has really experienced a renaissance on campus, and the Muslim Student Union hosted almost 100 events this year. And like Sheriff Baca, Ali is an alum of USC's School of Planning, Policy, and Development. He is also a New Ground Fellow, which is a partnership between the Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Progressive Jewish Alliance. So please join me in welcoming Ali Mir.
Thank you, Varun. I wanted to frame this evening's panel before I introduce each of our individual panelists. As a Muslim American, as a USC alum, and as someone that studied public policy as a part of my academic endeavors, I took these radicalization hearings very seriously, and I know no other home than the United States, and I intend to live here and raise a next generation of little Ali Mirs running around. For this reason, I have a vested interest in understanding what caused these hearings and what we can do as Muslims and Americans to understand the implications of these hearings and how to engage in a constructive and productive manner that allows us to represent ourselves freely and within the larger spectrum of the society in this country. If you'll indulge me, I just want to frame radicalization in terms of the Muslim population in this country. Since the attacks that took place in the United States on September 11th, there have been a total of 161 Muslims in the United States that were suspects or perpetrators in terrorist acts. The study assessed criminal investigations of terrorist acts and plots in the U.S. that included Muslim suspects between 2001 and 2010. There are an estimated 2.595 million Muslims living in the United States, according to the Pew Research Center that released a study on January 11th. Based on Professor Kurtzman's study, from 2001 to 2010, an average of 17.98 Muslims per year were suspects or perpetrators of terrorist acts, failed or realized, and potential terrorist activities in the United States. That average equates to less than 0.0000007% of the 2010 Muslim population in the United States. Based on this quantitative data, we are compelled to ask ourselves, why was this radicalization hearing necessary? Is radicalization a trend? Is it a trend that requires quantitative resources to be allocated? And what can we do in the fields of academia, in the fields of law enforcement, in the fields of media, and in the field of counterterrorism public policy? How do we understand this and how do we engage? There were some concerns that were raised that there's no Muslim panelists, and that we have a panel about radicalization, about Muslims, but not a single panelist is Muslim. And I'd like to make this very clear. This panel was conceived by students at this university. The content of the panel was conceived by students. The individual panelists were selected and sought by students. And the Office of Religious Life, Dean Soni, and myself simply acted as catalysts to make this panel happen. So what the Muslim students that came together that organized this panel wanted to hear was from the experts. From the gatekeepers, from the policymakers, from those in a position of authoritative power that have the ability to understand these issues, define these issues, and act upon them in a way that will impact all of us. With that, I'd like to begin with some brief bios. We have Professor Stephen O'Leary, who is an associate professor in the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He has his PhD from Northwestern University. His research focuses on religious communication, rhetorical theory, and criticism. Dr. O'Leary is the author of Arguing the Apocalypse, a study of the rhetoric of millennialism in American culture. Some of his current projects include a study of religion on the internet and a book on cults and persuasive persuasion.
Haven't corrected that yet.
Okay. It's also a very difficult alliteration. To my right, we have Dr. Lori Brand, who's the Robert Granford Wright Professor and Professor of International Relations. She has a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, a master's in International Affairs from Columbia, and a PhD in Comparative Politics from Columbia. Dr. Brand is She served as the director for the Center for International Relations from 1997 to 2000, and as the director of the School of International Relations here at USC from 2006 to 2009. She's a past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and currently a chair of its Committee on Academic Freedom. She specializes in Middle East international relations and inter-Arab politics. She was a Carnegie Scholar from 2008 to 2010, and a four-time Fulbright Scholar to the Middle East and North Africa. She's the author of Palestinians in the Arab World, Institution Building and the Search for a State, Jordan's Inter-Arab Relations, the Political Economy of Alliance Making, and Women, the State and Political Liberalization, and Citizens Abroad, States and Migrations in the Middle East and North Africa. Her current research interests include immigration, state-expatriate relations, and national narrative construction. She has carried out fieldwork in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Kuwait. She's fluent in Arabic and French, highly proficient in Spanish, and has a basic working knowledge of Hebrew and German. The bios are getting longer, so I'm just warning you in advance. We also have Errol Southers. He is an expert on transportation security and counterterrorism. He is currently the Assistant Chief of Los Angeles World Airport's Office of Homeland Security and Intelligence, and the Associate Director of the University of Southern California's Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, CREATE, which is also a co-sponsor of this evening's event. He is a former special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and was a Deputy Director of Homeland Security for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California. In 2009, he was nominated by President Obama to become the head of the TSA. Mr. Southers earned his Bachelor's of Arts degree at Brown University and his Master's of Public Administration right here at USC. He is also currently pursuing a doctoral thesis that focuses on social network analysis, predictive indicators of homegrown Islamic terror cells. He is a senior fellow of the UCLA and we won't hold that against him, School of Public Affairs. And last but not least, we have Sheriff Lee Baca. Sheriff Baca commands the largest sheriff's department in the United States with a budget of $2.4 billion. He leads over 18,000 budgeted, sworn, and professional staff. The sheriff's department is the law enforcement provider to 42 unincorporated cities, 130 unincorporated communities, 10 community colleges, and over 1 million daily commuters of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and Metrolink. Over 4 million people are directly protected by the sheriff's department. The Sheriff's Department also protects 48 superior courts and 600 bench officers. Moreover, the department manages the nation's largest local jail system, housing nearly 20,000 prisoners. Sheriff Baca is the Director of Homeland Security Mutual Aid for California Region 1, which includes the County of Orange. Region 1 serves 13 million people. Sheriff Baca has incorporated innovative best practices into his leadership style based on proactive, progressive problem solving. Sheriff Baca earned his Doctorate of Public Administration degree from right here, USC. He is a life member of the Honor Society Phi Kappa Phi USC chapter. A strong advocate of education, he developed the LA Sheriff's Department University in conjunction with 20 universities where over 1,000 members of the Sheriff's Department are enrolled in bachelor's and master's degree programs. Please welcome me in joining this panel. What has radicalization meant, and who have radicals been in the history of the United States in a pre-9/11 and non-Muslim context? Anybody?
Well, I don't know if I would quite term the referenced radicalism, but when I think about this problem, I think about it in terms of sort of long-term and historical view of U.S. foreign policy towards the part of the world which is Muslim majority. In the 1950s and the 1960s, when these countries were coming out of the colonial grip, coming to independence, the primary concern of the United States was with whether these countries would be aligned with the Soviet Union or with the United States. So the major driving foreign policy division or dichotomy, if you will, was between those countries that were basically aligned with the West and those that were aligned with the Soviet Union or its various partners in the Eastern Bloc. So it was really the way of looking at this region was in terms of those of the groups that were operative, the governments that were operative, and whether they were friendly to the United States or whether they were friendly to the Soviet Union. So it was communism or non-communism that was the driving force, and that's the way that we categorized the various the new regimes. So that when countries came to independence, such as Egypt, you had people that saw themselves as nationalist, but the way that the U.S. had divided up the world was that there really wasn't kind of a third way. There was this aligning yourself with the West or with the Soviet Union. So third world nationalists tended to be viewed as communists because they weren't exactly with us. And that's kind of the way that this dichotomous way of looking at the world continued. We then had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which was the first real emergence of a powerful political movement that associated itself with Islam, that comes to power in a major country. And so that, I think, begins to lead to some reorientations in thinking, but not enough so that the U.S., for example, had any problems supporting mujahideen in Afghanistan, again, against the Soviets. So these fighters, many of whom ultimately become members of what we know today as the Taliban, had an intersection of interests with the United States at that time. So they weren't referred to as radicals. These were freedom fighters. That's the language that was used at the time because it had to do with the alignment of interests with the United States. So I think, just to sum up briefly what I would say, once we have sort of the end of communism, once the Berlin Wall falls and we have the overturning of the various regimes in Eastern Europe and then ultimately in the Soviet Union as well, there no longer is this communist boogeyman, and what ends up replacing it, it's obviously a process that needs needs more detail than I'm going to give it here. We begin to have more and more people looking at Islam, Islamism, political Islam, as something which is threatening to the United States. And so that begins to, I think, take fuller form in the 1990s, and then moving up to the present. So, and again, putting it in historical perspective, a switch from earlier concerns about radicalism, which was sort of secular ideologies, the communism and related ideologies, which gradually moved and now has found Islam or Islamism, political Islam, as the new target.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer the question as posed in a very direct way. History of radicalism, or the concept of radical in this country, is perhaps a bit beyond my scope of expertise. But there are a couple of things I can say that I could pick up on what Professor Brand just said. I think a lot of what we're seeing in the public controversies over Islam in the public sphere now is really, in large part, a function or a consequence of the disappearance of the Soviet Union as the demonized other from the Cold War era. And I hadn't actually expected to talk about this at all, but in my book, Arguing the Apocalypse, I talk about American fundamentalists who have a schedule and a whole scenario for the Battle of Armageddon, which back in the 70s and 80s was all about a climactic battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And one of the things that I did in studying those communities, Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth and a later book called 1980s Countdown to Armageddon, was to look in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, how they went about explaining, well, the demon that we thought we were fighting is now gone, and they had to find another demon. And so they did in what they call radical Islam. And it didn't take Hal Lindsey very long. A couple of years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he had shifted gears, and all the prophetic texts which he had once identified as referring to the Soviet Union all of a sudden are now clearly depicting Islamic forces in the Middle East and in Central Asia. So a lot of this, I think, it has to do with our need to find an enemy who, is it fits right into the class of civilizations thesis, which of course I'm sure all of you will have heard Huntington's thesis on, that we're fundamentally at war. What used to be called Christendom versus Islamdom. I don't know what the right word is for that, but it seems to me that we kind of need an enemy who is a clear-cut, demonized other to rally around. And post 9/11, this was already underway before 9/11, but once 9/11 sort of cemented that. And there's more that I could say, but I'll save that for another answer.
Well, I'm going to bring this a little closer to home, and I'm always sensitive to this because obviously being a person of color and radicalization means something very different to me. I'm going to date myself here and say I grew up at a time, went through 2 sets of riots on the East Coast, and went through the 1968 Olympics in the Black Fist Salute, had my Angela Davis poster on the wall. Black Panther Party. I had relatives that were in the Nation of Islam, understood the weather underground, and the enemy was us. So for me, radicalization was one of, at that time, in groups like the Black Panther Party and others, of dealing with a system in the United States that was pushing back against, quote, oppressors. And for those of you who've done your homework on groups like Black Panther Party and others, you'll know that they were not solidly of one color. They were people who were engaged in fighting back against oppression. I think today, I will agree with my colleagues in that we are always looking for someone. But I think here the difference may lie in a term now of extremist versus perhaps terrorist. And by that I mean, radicalization, anybody could be radicalized and not engaged in violence. You could be extremist and not engaged in violence. And I think that's where the line gets drawn in the sand for me personally. So I think as we talk about radicalization today, unfortunately it's become associated with Islam. It's been unduly so. But as I've said already, we're always looking for someone to associate this term with and using it in a negative context, but I think very much so in the 60s and early 70s, there were movements here that were radical, that weren't always violent, and certainly weren't always trying to overthrow the United States government or preaching extreme violence as we see today. So again, from a very, very different perspective, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm very sensitive to this because you know, being a person of color, I understand how these labels can be thrown around, and how I understand how quickly the tide turns and how quickly, unfortunately, segments of this nation have turned.
Since we have a historic framework and that led into more of a contemporary context, this question is for Dr. Brand. What international trends have been emerging in recent years and recent months around grassroots resistance movements in the Muslim world that have been attributed to so-called radicalization of Muslims? And how are they similar to non-Muslim or secular grassroots resistance movements?
Well, we've had for some time, for decades, and with increasing, posing increasing problems, regimes in what is broadly called the Islamic world, although, of course, we have Muslims all around the world now, so the term I have a lot of trouble with, but let's say in Muslim-majority countries, which includes the Arab world and then well into South Asia and other places. We have problems of corrupt governments, of inefficient governments. We have extreme repression, and some of these governments are closely aligned with the United States, which means that groups that emerge that are opposed to those governments often will have anti-Americanism or a resistance to the United States as part of their program, simply because of the degree of support that these governments have received from the United States. There have been a variety over the years. I've always been perplexed by people talking about how Islam is a fatalistic religion, because I've been struck over the years, my own studies, particularly the Arab world, but I know this extends beyond the Arab world, people's willingness to rise up against oppressors, against oppressive, whether it's a local provincial governor or whether it is against a central government. So there is a strong sense of our understanding of what social justice should be, and of the kind of repression, the kind of violations of rights and of justice that many of these governments have engaged in. That then has produced a number of movements, some of them more organized than others. In an earlier period, these tended to be organized along more secular lines. But as time passed, part of this process of interaction between nationalist, secularist regimes and those who were opposed to them led to a kind of discrediting of these groups that were largely organized along or had secularist ideologies. And in some ways, religion, and of course this region, because Islam is the majority religion, Islam was there as a possible way of organizing oneself. Because of the principles of justice, the demands for a just ruler, it was a natural, it offered a natural set of principles around which people might organize. In addition to that, because of the importance of the mosque, of daily prayer, and certainly of Friday prayer, in societies that were repressive, the mosque became one place, in some countries at least, where some space was available for a somewhat greater freedom. So it was in some ways natural that mosques could become, and did become in some countries, places that attracted people who then would organize or put forward an oppositional message. I think one of the really remarkable things, one of the very impressive things that we've seen in the last several months in this wave of revolutions in the Arab world is the degree to which there have been, among both the young as well as middle-aged and older people, an interaction, a cooperation among various groups. Some of these revolutions are more inchoate than others. Some of them have clearer leaderships than others. But one of the things that's very clear, and we'll take the example of Egypt as one of the two successful ones, along with Tunisia, the degree to which secularists and people who define themselves as Islamists or members of the Muslim Brotherhood work together against an oppressive regime. it's really, truly remarkable. And foreign coverage of these revolutions or these revolts kept looking for radicals. Is Al-Qaeda there? Is the Muslim Brotherhood going to take over in Egypt? And I think instead what these have done has been to demonstrate a different kind of message, a different way of practicing politics, certainly different from the kind of authoritarian politics of the governments in place, which I think have given some people, at least, who looked at the region and always saw Muslims and saw radicals, extremists, terrorists, whatever, given them the pause and forced them to confront perhaps a new paradigm, or a paradigm that's opened up once these repressive governments are finally dispatched. So that's the.
This question is for Dr. O'Leary. Last week, President Obama was in California, and he was visiting the Facebook headquarters, and Mark Zuckerberg asked him a question about Republican proposals to trim Medicare and Medicaid. And President Obama said in response, "I think it's fair to say that their vision is radical." When associated with Muslims, the term radical in the so-called process of radicalization has a very specific meaning. In a contemporary context, the word is used to mean multiple things. Can you please discuss the malleable use of the word radical in the media and how it is co-opted for particular vantage points to be represented?
Sure. I'll have a stab at that. I think actually in my answering this, I'm going to hijack the question and take it in a different direction.
By all means.
Yeah. In reflecting on this, the topic of today's panel, I began thinking about the word radical as an adjective modifying different nouns, and what that, how as a signifier or a marker with particular symbolic significance, how that changes. It's one thing to say radical Republicans. When we think of radical Republicans, we don't think of people plotting, with terrorist plots against, trying to blow up the Capitol dome. We think of radical Republicans as somebody who are sabotaging the president's agenda, but we don't think of them as violent. And so there, in that case, radical means extreme, and but that's a kind of natural sort of homeostatic process in American politics, where everybody's trying to sort of hog the center and push their opponents off to the margins, and that's a natural thing. And and yet something different seems to be operating when we use the term radical Islam or radical Muslims, because there may be fringe elements in the Islamic faith who have a particular interpretation of Islam which justifies violence, but is really not about a struggle for the center there. I mean, within the Islamic community you may have that, but in this country, radical Muslims or radical Islam or radicalization actually functions as a term of demonization. And in a way that's not that far away from what President Obama is trying to do when he's characterizing his opposition as radicals, except that the symbolic significance of it and the practical effect of it is very different. And so actually one of the things I wanted to say, in reflecting on this, which is sort of getting a little bit away from the base of the question, is I think we need to see the controversy over the hearings on radicalization of the Islamic community in the context, a broader context, to make some sense of it. And so I would sort of advocate three sort of contextual factors that need to be looked at. I'm not going to talk about all of them now, but first is perceptions of Muslims and of the Islamic religion among other religious communities, such as especially fundamentalist Christians. Secondly is popular culture depictions of Islam. And third is other controversies over Islam in the public sphere. I refer to things like the Park 51 complex. But with regard to the fundamentalist Christian vision of Islam, I think when you have a prominent Christian evangelist who delivers the invocation at George W. Bush's inaugural, characterizing Islam as an evil and wicked religion, when you have a prominent Southern Baptist leader characterizing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a demon-possessed pedophile, I think what we're seeing is normalization of hate speech directed at a particular religious community, and it's not without precedent. I think it's a fascinating thing to compare anti-Muslim rhetoric today with anti-Catholic rhetoric in American history, and some of the fears expressed about Catholics in days of yore, up until 1960, when John Kennedy's election sort of neutralized that anti-Catholic hatred. But some of the fears expressed about Catholics that are identical to those now heard about Muslims. They owe allegiance to foreign powers. They cannot be trusted because their religion justifies deception of outsiders. And this fits neatly with popular culture depictions like 24, where you have Special Agent Jack Bauer happily torturing Muslim suspects who are all, of course, manifestly guilty of terrorism. He wouldn't torture, he only tortures guilty people. And I wanted to show a couple of clips from shows like that to make this point. But there was one particular episode of 24, which I remember vividly, where there is a terrorist dad, I believe he's Persian or Iranian, I may be getting that part wrong, but he's getting ready to kill his son, who he thinks is disloyal to the cause. And I mean, just the idea that somebody would, like kill their own child in the service of a particular religious faith strikes me as deeply disturbing. Lastly, I'll say about the Park 51 complex and so on. I think it's not at all a coincidence that Representative Peter King is a Long Island congressperson, and that the controversy over the Park 51 Islamic complex there really has escalated from a local controversy to a national one. And I think that he's both picking up on the sort of after effects or the vibration that shockwave that controversy set out through the culture, and playing this for what he can, for what it's worth, what he can get from it. And about Park 51, I would say it's really interesting that when we define Ground Zero as sacred space, even so that space seems to get larger and larger, so that it's okay to have a strip club and liquor stores near Ground Zero, but it's not okay to have an Islamic cultural center. And it seems to me that what's at stake there in the Ground Zero Park 51 complex debate is something really that's also going on with these hearings, which is that the public sphere, or the sacred space of Ground Zero, is expanded in a way which actually contracts the public sphere, specifically to exclude Muslims. And I think that's a deeply disturbing trend. And we can see that it's not just about Ground Zero, but the fact that there are other mosques in areas of the country. Some of you may have seen the TV documentary about the Murfreesboro, Tennessee case, where they were building a mosque on the outskirts of town, and their project was vandalized and met with huge community opposition. And there's no Ground Zero there. What are they complaining about? So I think we're seeing the legitimization of hate speech, and I think that's a deeply disturbing thing. So sorry for taking it so far away, but.
This question is for Sheriff Baca. In this context where Islamophobia is becoming rampant, and by virtue of the fact that a person is Muslim, their allegiance to the United States is questioned, how do you, as someone that leads one of the largest local law enforcement agencies in the country, employ community policing and civic engagement with Muslim American communities in a way that builds trust on both sides?
Okay, well, thank you for the question, and thank all of you in the audience for being here. I'm delighted that you would take the time off of your busy lives to come here and listen to this panel, and I hope that we provide you with a lot of evocative thought processes that can help you with whatever point of view you take. First of all, this whole idea of what people's opinion is often the byproduct of no research or no planning or anything else. It's intuitively instinctive, and it's gut conversation. And we have, I was surprised that we didn't hear anything about Ken and John and some of the others that are out there that take issues up and just let everyone blast on, and then we call that intelligent discourse and problem solving. The truth is that America is woefully uninformed about quite a bit. I mean, we're unhappy about traffic. We got to get to the soccer games. The gasoline prices are too high. I mean, this is what we all worry about, including Muslims. And, when you think about the whole subject matter to this point of our conversation, what law enforcement likes to do is build relationships and trust. This is what we do in our public trust policing strategy. community-based policing is an important phraseology, but no one really pinned it down as to what the objective is, other than, in my opinion, to get the public's trust, that if you don't have a legitimized public support with all members of the community, those that like you and those that don't like you. You see, the great thing about my office being elected is that, I have to serve everybody whether they like me or not. And there's where the problem is with most of our political leaders, is that they're catering to those that like them, and they're basically unconcerned about those that are willing to like them, but they have to have more reason than some of the stuff that comes out of our elected officials' mouths. And I believe that what we do to serve America right, and this is where I'm going to get to the answer specifically, when you're a president of a nation, a vice president, a member of the Senate, a member of the Congress, a mayor, a city councilman, a governor, a member of an assembly of a state legislature or a senate of a state legislature, or a sheriff, we all take the same oath of office. And the oath of office is to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, in the Constitution of the United States, there's an assemblage of laws that talk about what this country stands for. And then it talks about Bill of Rights, which people are entitled to by government. And then there's civil rights that are a byproduct of case law that has emerged over the history of everything that we've done to avoid the Constitution. And then we have human rights. And 21st century policing is all about human rights, because if you go from there up, but it's also the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, civil rights. So you have to outreach. I have Deputy Sheriff Morsi here. Why don't you stand up? He's a handsome guy. His parents are in the audience. So how about handing a little hand, a helping hand, to a community that seems to be besieged with a lot of criticism by people who don't even care to find out what they're saying is true or false. They just blast it out. But you have to have this outreach, which happened post 9/11. I convened a meeting of all the faith community. If we want to get to the core of human conduct, you can't police your way into a moral society. But there is a way to have religion play a huge role in a moral society, and that's what all religions are about. There is a moral core that's messaged through all of the different scriptures and imams and priests and rabbis and Buddhist priests as well, and the like. And you have to have this reality that the world's probably safer because of its religions than perhaps its police forces. And I know you haven't given it that thought, but I have. And so what I believe that was necessary is what happened at post 9/11 is that there's over 100 7-Eleven stores in Southern California owned by Pakistani Americans who are Muslims. And you know what the customers were doing? Oh, you must be real happy now. This is the day after 9/11. Oh, you must be really excited about what happened. And these owners were very offended by this kind of slur. And then there was others that were threatening to the owners of the stores. And as a result, I called in the interfaith community. I brought Governor Davis down. I had Mayor Hahn at the time, and I got Supervisor Yaroslavsky and Supervisor Antonio. I got as many leaders as I could, and we all sat together and we said, are we going to let Muslims get run over in the United States because of what happened in 9/11, or are we going to stand up and defend the Constitution of the United States? And we stood up in this county to defend the Constitution of the United States. So I sent deputies, and I had some of the 7-Elevens in Orange County. I called police departments all over the place. I says, we got some intimidation going on, backlash intimidation. We really need to reach out and say to the owners, if you are threatened, you must tell us so that we can start documenting this human conduct that could lead to firebombing. It could lead to defacing of their businesses. It could lead to even a physical attack. So I think there's the first point of my comment. Secondly, then, the question is, after 9/11, people like me had no concept about the world's problems when it comes to terrorism other than we read in the paper. So I knew we had to change everything in terms of our approach. So my thing is to engage as opposed to anything, to learn, to do what you're doing now, to learn from those who are Muslims and for those who are living in regions of the world that are at threat. So that became the next step. And then when the London bombings occurred, as you're all aware of, I said, now this is going to have to, we have to step it up another notch. So I got a hold of our Muslim American leaders here in the great county of Los Angeles and Orange, both counties, and we had a meeting, and I said, we need to form this Muslim American Homeland Security Congress. And we need to have a sense of unity as to how to do it. I don't know how to do it, but you guys know how to do it. So we formed it, and we wanted to establish some very strong secular fatwas. Okay, we wanted to put something out here that made it real clear that don't mix up religion with violent extremist behavior. It's incompatible. And there's, you know, all our faiths are as vulnerable as we are as human beings. And there are people occasionally pop up that want to change the history of a faith and tailor it to their own liking. And certainly that's happened in Christianity, and that's happened in some of the other faiths, and it's happened to some extent with even Islam. But when you get to the core of Islam, which we shared a lot together. It took us months to pull this organization together. Darfur is here. And Darfur, would you please stand up? He's the head of this. We call it the Muslim American Homeland Security Congress because we wanted it to be representative of all levels of the Muslim American society in Southern California. And Darfur's leadership has been stellar. And you know, we've got all the different groups behind it, including the Shura Council. And the whole point of this, you know, I'll conclude because I think I've said strongly where I think the policing approach should be, and that is to participate and to engage and to educate and not be disingenuous about it, to celebrate. And so to do that, we created a deputy sheriff leadership outreach with Sheriff Morrissey there and his partner Abdeen, and we got about 7 or 8 other Muslim deputy sheriffs involved in this. And we go everywhere, and we can go to universities, and we have a leadership group. And the whole concept is to partnership. And so when you get down to the core of the policing strategy, we have learned a lot about how Muslim Americans are living their lives like everybody else. And at the same time, you know, I happen to be the guy that reads the Quran. And so I go into the Quran a lot, and you'd be astounded how much play is made for Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the Quran. And you'd be surprised about how much play is about Moses and Judaism. And according to, if you really get to it, you can conclude, without being a Muslim, that honoring Judaism and Christianity is part of a Muslim belief process. Honoring. Not attacking or bombing or doing any of these other things that people who have obviously some mental issues are dragging the Quran into their issues. You know, I mean, but you can't do it. You know, the thing about a law enforcement guy being so involved in a faith community, and it's all faith, but now it's this community, the Muslim community's got the center stage right now. You learn differently. You learn to trust who teaches you more than who shouts at you. And I think that my role in testifying is to eliminate the shouting process and open up for the avenues of how you can get taught. And when members of Congress who swear to defend the Constitution, which means your rights, do not do that in their speech, they ought to resign their positions. Thank you.
This question is for Errol. In terms of, with this climate of Islamophobia and the moving target of defining violent radicalization in the context of Muslims, how do those in a position of power developing counterterrorism policies understand the issues as they're dynamic and changing, and employ counterterrorism policies that take civic engagement and civil rights into consideration?
Well, I'm going to actually take a lead from the sheriff as well. The most important thing that seems to be missing from a lot of the strategies that are being put forth is a human element. We've taken a very technical approach to our counterterrorism strategy with technology and equipment, and we've left out the cultural part of this whole process. There are three things in my world that we look at in terms of trying to detect, deter, defend against an act of terrorism. We understand that we've got an alienated individual, and of course, depending on your level of knowledge in terms of psychology, the term alienation can certainly be debated. We've got a legitimizing ideology, which of course, again, depending on the receiver of the information, that can certainly be leveraged in any way you like. But we do have something called a complicit society that we probably have the ability to have the most influence over. So I think what's missing and what we need to get better at is that dialogue with our societies with regards to how to protect that society. You know, no one has more acronyms than the Department of Homeland Security. I think there should probably be a moratorium on acronyms, but in any event, SARS is an acronym for Suspicious Activity Reporting. You've probably heard about it. The reason that it's important is because we understand that for a 10-year period between 1999 and 2009, 80% of the terrorist plots were thwarted by law enforcement or citizens reporting things that look suspicious. Of that 80%, another 40% was reported by citizens who thought things looked suspicious. So what we have to do is engage that society in a dialogue on what keeps it safe. And it's not just about terrorism, it's about crime, it's about emergency preparedness, it's about natural disasters as well as man-enabled events. And I think that that's the dialogue that's missing. I also believe that, in going back to the reason that we're here this evening, I'm still left with the question of how the congressional hearings advanced our national security strategy. Or how the hearings advanced our Homeland Security policies. You know, what was the intended outcome? So for that society that we need to engage to single them out in the way that we did, I'm not quite sure if that was the best approach to advancing our national security. And so I think what we have to do is close ranks and develop relationships, partnerships, dialogue. We saw it over the holidays last year with pat-downs, and it happened with everybody. And I'm going to stick with aviation, it's my area of expertise. A lack of dialogue led to a protest. So here we had a population we were trying to protect that wound up protesting against the strategies that were being put in place in the first place, which is the worst of all perfect storms, again, because of a lack of dialogue and a lack of engagement. So it's the education process, as the sheriff mentioned earlier, that I think is most important. An education process, an intelligence process, meaning intelligence that comes from the community that we can use in a very thoughtful way. Applied research that we're doing in places like here at USC at CREATE. And then more importantly, and the most important thing, is that engaged society that's going to support these policies and procedures to make us safe.
I think with that, unless there's any other comments or remarks that the panelists want to make before we ask the audience for questions, we can transition into a question and answer session. To do this as orderly as humanly possible with 3 microphones and 100 people, if you'd like to ask a question, if you could just come down here, I can hand you the microphone. My only request is that you ask a question and you don't make a statement, and that you keep your remarks to 60 seconds or less. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd appreciate it if you could do that. Are there any questions? Also, please give your name, your affiliation, if you're a USC student, community member, or whatever it may be.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Rothkushel. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, Silver Lake. I was on the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council for a while. I'm a community member, and my question has to do with the reclaiming of the term radical. And I think it was a very important question you asked at first, because radical means a couple of things. It means going to the root, and root can mean the bottom of understanding or the basis for an understanding. But it can also have a verb meaning rooting out, the rooting out of injustice. You spoke about injustice, the rooting out of criminality, the rooting out of, dare I say, treason in a society or a government. And so my question has to do with the radicals amongst us are those that would seek to root out the violent extremists. But what we've seen in the last century is that the biggest forms of violent extremism appear to come down from the top of our societies through governments and their intelligence agencies. And so I would like the panel to address the problem of, just recently, again, we saw that you know, an Al-Qaeda commander on the ground had MI6 British intelligence links, just like Anwar al-Awlaki was dining with top Pentagon brass months after 9/11. It appears Al-Qaeda is a counter-gang, and that the Islamic violent extremist threat is really a form of what might be a global imperial threat from the top down, run by a corporate criminal cartel.
Not really sure who wants to start off with that one.
Well, you know, that was a nice speech, a short one too. I think your comments are unanswerable. I think you're posing a theory of possibility. The truth is that what we do in police work, I'll say this, I ask deputies this all the time. Have you ever been in over your head? And there isn't a cop in the world that's been on the beat 10 years that's not had that experience of being in over your head. Do you know that sometimes governments are in over their head? Do you know that people that are functionaries in any kind of role that's got a lot of authority are sometimes over their head? And I think this whole thing about violent extremists, terrorists, they've got us all over our head with this issue. We really don't know exactly how to unprogram this. We use military solutions at times when we should use police solutions. We try police solutions. It works most of the time, but it doesn't work all the time. There's a scared reality to all this stuff. And so the point then is, take it the other way. Ask how many people are truly intimidated by terrorism. And I believe there's a lot of people that are. And so then the question is, as you pose, what is most appropriate? To me, it's counterintuitive to want to kill yourself, number one. To me, it's also counterintuitive to want to kill anybody else. But this is happening. And more of it's happening outside of the terrorist world than in the terrorist world. There's just a lot of killing going on. And what I believe that we don't talk about is there's a theological reality to all human life, whether we believe in God or not. It doesn't matter. We can't replicate life, so you know we procreate, but that's the best we can do. But we can't come up with little samples in a petri dish. But the truth is that we are a violent reality of Earth, human beings. And you don't have to be radical to get violent. You just have to be off your core for 10 seconds, and you can kill somebody. And so what I'd like to hear is where's all this violence? What's the root of it? And we don't know. And so your elegant commentary is that violence will attract violence. And that's really the theme of what you just said. And I say you're absolutely right.
I'll speak to that for a moment. I think that there's I guess it was Max Weber who gave a definition of the state is that power which has the monopoly over the legitimate use of force. And I think you're absolutely right to say that many of our government's actions, both at home and abroad, have been, you know, we have as a people, because legitimated this government by voting it into power. We invaded Iraq under the flimsiest of pretexts, and then, although you could say that the 2004 election was stolen, I think there's some evidence for that, but I still would say, you know, we have that on our heads, that we reelected George Bush after prosecuting an unjust war. And so it's not just the imperialist powers from above, but we, in a democracy, we bear a collective responsibility for the governments that we elect. And that government is guilty of war crimes and lots of things, imperialism, both cultural and military, at home and abroad. And you know, I share these concerns, and I think I applaud, on one level, the effort to reclaim the term radical as a badge of honor. But you're not going to get very far with that, because the media will continue to demonize radicals, and we should just sort of suck it up, and it's not going to change.
I mean, one thing that I want to say as the moderator and as the one Muslim on the stage here is a point that both Sheriff Baca and Errol brought up, which is marginalization. And I think that when we're talking about the radicalization of Muslims, that is code for marginalized Muslims. Look at the Muslims in this room. I mean, I don't think anyone in this room is really being accused of potentially being a terrorist. So I think that there's the perception of terrorism, and that there's a tangible fear among many Americans that they're going to be subject to terrorism at the hands of a Muslim or at the hands of an American. And then there's the quantitative evidence. And one of the reasons that I supported my students in bringing this panel together was to really talk about that disconnect. The real fear that cannot be ignored and cannot be discounted versus the tangible evidence of quantitative data that's been compiled over the course of the last 10 years of planned, executed, and foiled terrorist activities. That's why I started with that quantitative data. And there is no nexus between that real fear and the quantitative evidence. And I think that needs to be explored, that needs to be put on the forefront, and I challenge everyone on this panel, and I challenge all of us as Americans to talk about these issues, to know about these issues, and to research these issues without discounting the real fear that people experience. In the same way that I know that my mother and my sisters didn't leave the house for a month and a half wearing a scarf in their head because they thought they were going to get beat up, and I had to go get the groceries for everyone. So, I mean, in the same way that we experience that fear, I don't want to invalidate the fear that another person feels, because I know exactly what it's like to be in their shoes. So in terms of the term radical, I agree with you that there's things that we could do and that we would like to do in order to reclaim the word and associate it with nonviolence. But in the current climate, it's going to be a difficult thing to do.
One more thing about that. I mean, we had, back in the 90s, things like the bombing in Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh, who perpetrated that act, was associated with some radical Christian sects. Nobody called them radical Christians. So radical Muslims, these are people who are prone to terrorism. Radical Christians, you don't hear the phrase. And although there's just as much danger in this country from Christians who are off their rocker, or in fact more of a danger, I think, from Christians who espouse violence than Muslims.
Some of them run the Pentagon, which was actually my question, is how far up, and we're all against violent extremism, those of us that are not mentally unstable, but does not the violent extremism, is it not a strategy of tension coming from the highest levels on down?
I think the echo.
Yeah, but even those people who call themselves Christian in Congress, I mean, at what level does homicide become state's policy, especially when it's based on lies?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think when it's one thing to focus on the notion of radicalism and the degree to which that may overlap with terrorism, but it seems to me that in the Muslim community, the degree to which, or for Muslims, the degree to which sort of external, what I'll call political entrepreneurs, are focusing not just on issues of, say, terrorism per se, but on issues like Sharia, how many states now have laws that are currently being discussed where to prohibit the implementation of Sharia law? I mean, and regular concerns that are raised about women wearing the hijab. It's probably more of an issue now in France with this new niqab law. But it's taking not just sort of what could be described as fringe behavior, but taking basic elements of Muslim life and turning them into something which is to be a source of concern, which is to create fear. So I mean, I think that's even a step beyond that. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just extreme behavior, whether it's violent or not, but it's also things that are central to the people's identity as Muslims that are being turned into symbols of something which is a fear.
I'd like to add to that I think we have much more to fear from Christians who want to impose biblical law in this country than we do from Muslims who want to impose Sharia.
Do you mind coming down here just a bit?
Sure. I just have a question. My name's Aaron. I'm a community member. Just, I don't think everyone can be on the panel, especially the law enforcement. I have just a certain questions directed to members of law enforcement, which is how do practitioners of law enforcement, and I'm thinking of infiltration of mosques, or the alleged infiltration of mosques in Orange County, affect then law enforcement's ability to then dialogue and actually build trust within the Islamic community when law enforcement is often seen as doing things that is actually targeting the Islamic community?
Well, you're alluding to the FBI's federal strategy of finding a person to essentially hire and put in a mosque and look for extremist conversation. It doesn't work that well in that particular case, as you know. It kind of blew up, and the covert operations became coercive operations, and it was pulled back by the FBI. So I can't account for that. But the whole point of how do people choose to disclose a troubling contact in the family or outside of family, that's the issue. I mean, the key to any plot development is secrecy. But the first people that know about change of behavior is generally a family or close friends. The theory of disclosure should be one of sensitive protection more than anything else of those who are doing the disclosing. But they will disclose, as you heard. To give you some statistics, America in the last 10 years has been under more radical, violent attack plans by non-Muslim sources than Muslim sources, over 70. The 41 plots in the last 10 years that have involved Muslims, substantial Muslim Americans have been part of the disclosure process. And the point then is, and even the most absurd example of missing an opportunity was when Abdul Muttalib's father goes to the Nigerian American embassy and says, "My son's getting a little weird on me." And we couldn't quite catch that one. And he's on before you know, he's on the plane and he doesn't get to set off his bomb in his shoe. But the key to he got a passport. And so the whole thing is, okay, let me answer this. I'll get that. You want to take over the answer?
I appreciate that you show respect for the space and for the panelists and for the attendees that would like to hear the answer.
So and I support what you're saying, but I know you were anxious to say it. The key to what the concept of how do you acquire useful, investigatable information is a delicate matter. People are afraid. Even Muslims are afraid, by the way, of terrorists. And to expand on the theme earlier of Dr. Brand, one of the obligations that people like me have had to go to is traveling abroad and learning what Muslims do in Muslim nations to fight terrorism. That's one of the key elements of education. So I've gone to Pakistan, I've gone to Saudi, I've gone to Qatar, I've gone to Jordan, I was in Egypt last December, able to learn from their police what their issues are and how they deal with it, and they're no different than ours. And so the context of how do you go about ferreting out violent extremist plots is the issue. Not radical, violent extremist plots. I think we kind of got a lot into the radical stuff, but radicals have been around the world in every society since the beginning of man, and even in the process of the book of Genesis, I mean, the radical said, the woman made me do it. I ate the apple. So, no one wants to, radicals don't take responsibility for what their radical points of view are, is my point. But people of faith do take a lot of responsibility for what their particular weaknesses are.
I wanted to actually follow up on that question, and this is for... Okay.
Okay.
I actually wanted to explore the concept of entrapment a little bit further, and if an individual that doesn't have radical ideologies, that doesn't want to be a terrorist, is introduced to these ideas, and again, they're marginalized either socially, religiously, culturally, politically, and someone encourages them to do something that in their right mind they would not have come up with on their own. Is that really a foiled terrorist attempt, or is that a statistic of a failed terrorist attempt when the seed was planted by someone who is in a position of law enforcement? And when does it become counterterrorism, and when does it kind of stray into the boundaries of entrapment? And if Errol or Sheriff Baca could discuss that briefly.
Well, there have been a number of plots over the last year that could fit the description that you've given. And I don't want to go into any details here about any particular one or what may have happened. I can say this, that what we're weighing in cases like that is capability and intent. So if a person has the intent and they're introduced with that kind of potential, certainly there's an argument that could be made. But they have to have capability to be able to do it as well. I know that as going back to the other question and tying these two together, you lose trust of that community when you have those kinds of things that are raised in that way. There have been a number of cases recently where we've had foiled plots and there's a suggestion that there is entrapment, and of course, we'll certainly see once the process unfolds with regards to the facts that are being deliberated. But this understanding in terms of counterterrorism is a two-way street, and it's all based on trust. Law enforcement over the last 2 to 3 decades, which I was a part of as well, and my career is much shorter than the sheriff's, has undergone a tremendous paradigm shift. And it underwent a paradigm shift because most of you know that law enforcement now looks like the community that it serves. And this isn't my recruitment speech, but I will say this. I have my share of students in my class that I encourage to go to the FBI, that I encourage to go to the CIA, that I encourage to go to the Sheriff's Department, because they need to be dialoguing with the community that they live in and they serve, because they understand that community. So I think it's a two-way street. It's built on trust, and cases and descriptions as you've given just now, when those kinds of things prove to be true, they're damaging beyond years or perhaps even longer than we can even fathom in terms of what it does to our efforts. What I want, if I'm trying to recruit someone to do something nefarious, is a community that I can reside in comfortably. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. Without the community, we have no basis for our counterterrorism efforts.
Thank you very much for coming. So my question is, that most of the fear in the society that I see around is not based on the ground reality that you guys have mentioned. It's mostly based on the depictions of that reality in a certain way in the media. So the question is there a way to police Fox News?
Would you repeat that last part of the
What?
Is there a way to police Fox News, is what I believe he said.
Oh, that's a terrific question.
Great idea.
The answer is no to that, but You know, the hard part about America, you know, think back when America was just colonies, and then the Irish got beat up by the British when they got here. The Polish got beat up by the British and the Irish. The Jews were under some degree of hostile reaction from the Christians. This country is a experiment of how to do things wrong and then get it right later on, you know, but it takes decades and millenniums to get it right. And so, you know, the vestiges of bigotry are evident in the history throughout the entire time that we've had in America. But that's what happens when you take essentially nations that were homogeneous in its population, and then you bring them over to this new land, and they're forced to get along. And the New York wars are something that we can study and get a clear understanding of how violent they can get just within the American citizenship soil domain. You know, and so you got to say, well, what is it about human beings that is so vulnerable? And since I'm, you know, a praiser and protector of human beings in all its forms, I think the first step is to just know who to pay attention to and what to pay attention to, what not to pay attention to, and move on. And I tell people in my jail, they have, some of them have more common sense than some of them are not in jail. But I say to them, you know, there's one thing that you got to do if you're a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a Hindu, a Scientologist, a Sikh, whatever it is. You have to create a palace in your mind, or the world will be your prison. Okay, think about that, because if you allow someone to invade who you are by some absent thoughtlessness on their part, they're thoughtfully thoughtless. No, they want to get out that way because they think that makes them strong. You know, most of the people that got us in the Iraq War never put on a military uniform. And if you listen to McCain a little bit, he was kind of like reeling because he knows what it's like to get shot down. You know, and people that are generals are generally not trusted, but the truth is they're the ones that are more humane about death than those that are not involved in death. And so the key to your security as a human being, speaking to all of you, is that my security, and I'll tell you what it is that I have no ill will towards anyone. I do towards some acts of violence. It's the acts of violence that I have the ill will toward. But I don't choose to look at society as too big a problem and we can never solve it. Otherwise, I shouldn't do what I'm doing. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing.
My name is Taha. I'm a second-year engineering student here at USC. And I guess it's kind of a simple question. It's kind of a continuation on what you were just talking about, Sheriff Baca. But I guess kind of where do you see this going in the future? Because, I mean, I know that parallels have been drawn. Like, you mentioned a couple of things that have happened in history. Of course, there's like parallels like marginalization, like in terms of like how the Japanese were marginalized during World War II with the internment camps, like the civil rights movements. But I guess sort of starting, I guess, 9/11-ish, or around that period of time, I guess this stereotype was first attached to Muslims, and it's kind of built up because just from being a stereotype, now it's to the point where you're kind of seeing legal action taken. So like the Peter King hearings, there was the laws banning Sharia, I believe in Oklahoma, but there's that, and then there's like the movements to keep this mosque from being built at Ground Zero. But I mean, I feel like it's taken on another dimension, is that it's moved from just stereotyping and just, you know, like talk to now legal action. And I mean, of course, nothing's passed yet, but where do you see this going in the future, I guess?
Well, you know, there's phases of very transformational societal behavioral focus, and this is right now the spotlight on violent extremism is on Islam. Okay. I think you're in great shape. I think the Muslim American society is in much better shape than the African American society was, the Japanese society was, and even back to the founding fathers' days, and even the Chinese when they were brought to rebuild railroads. You're in far better shape because there are mosques getting built in very conservative Christian communities like Temecula, where the 5 city council members and the mayor said when they were being attacked by their own residents for approving the building of a mosque in Temecula, and the council members that were quoted by the media and back to the media can do some good things when the opportunity is there. It's just that it's easier to have a conflict going on than it is to not. But the key is that the one councilman said, I'm not voting for a mosque. I'm voting for the Constitution of America. That's a guy that's got it right. You see, and when you look at this whole of challenges, you look at the Muslim American society is not in mass numbers in local jails, and I happen to have one, so I know what I'm saying here. And you got a whole lot of action going on with education. You got a couple of schools that you have for the, they're essentially for all kids, but obviously managed by Muslim American educators, and they're darn good schools. And you got over 60 mosques in the Southern California area, and we're building a new one in San Gabriel Valley, a Islamic center in San Gabriel Valley. And any of you invited to go to any mosque, those of you that are not Muslim, you decide to go to one. Just say, when's prayer time, and you just go in, and if you want to just observe, then observe. But the key is that you're in great shape, and you're getting in better shape because those hearings were more positive than negative. I was there. But I was able to go under the auspices of the Democrats, and they were more fearful of what these hearings would turn to than the Republicans. But the Republicans added a little more common sense to the dimension, and the chairman was very gracious towards me. Now, I'm the one telling them essentially that they're wrong. But the cordiality was not hostile back to me. And what you shouldn't be afraid of is sensible dialogue, even if the lead-up is fearful dialogue. And being Hispanic, or maybe being a Mexican-American, I know what it's like to be on the other end of negative dialogue. But and I got on it when my parents named me Leroy. Now, no one's heard of a Mexican named Leroy in the world. and so my point is that if you can't take some criticism, some ridicule, not for what you do, but for someone who's claiming to be a Muslim does. And that's the byproduct of how societies react. You see, and you can't make it your personal problem. If I took in all the issues that are facing me in my job today, I'd be a basket case. But I choose to stay close to diversity, and that's what Muslims should look at as an issue. Stay close to diversity. You want more security? Stay closer to diversity. Stay closer to other religions. Stay closer to other ethnic groups. Stay closer to other races. The more you assimilate into the rest of the experiences of other people, they will protect you.
I'd like to speak to that briefly. It's an excellent question. I guess I would share second what the sheriff has just said. I'd like to maybe this will be my last comment tonight, and on a more optimistic note. We have a long history of anti-religious bigotry in this country, and I made reference earlier to anti-Catholicism. It's not just Catholics. In 1817, the New York State Legislature tried to pass laws basically stripping members of the Shaker religious community of their civil rights. In the 1830s, there were popular anger against the Catholic Church and against Catholic communities that were sparked by the publication of a book called The Awful Confessions of Maria Monk of the Hotel de Dieu nunnery in Montreal, that book is still in print. It's about a girl who gets raped by priests and all kinds of horrible things. That book is still in print. But in 1835, there were riots in Philadelphia where a Catholic convent was burned to the ground by an angry mob who thought there was all these bad things going on because they had read this book. Now, those beliefs, those anti-Catholic prejudices still exist, but they've been neutralized. In this country, it took a century and a half for them to be neutralized. And it took the election of a Catholic president to make that happen. And now, you know, there are still anti-Catholic beliefs of this sort, but they're much farther away from the center or from the mainstream of American public life than they were. I think that will happen with Muslims as well in this country, as long as you persist in doing what you're doing and engaging in public dialogue, standing up for what you believe in and showing people that the stereotypes are untrue. So it's a normalization process, which may take a long time, but ultimately I'm optimistic. I have faith in this country.
I'll end on a more negative note. Not because I don't, but I think what the sheriff said and what Professor O'Leary said are true about American society, and that these are what Muslims are experiencing now has parallels in earlier immigrant groups, ethnic, religious, and so on's experience. I do think there is one difference in this case, and perhaps it's simply my lack of familiarity with some of the earlier waves. But the anti-Muslim sentiment is caught up not just with a process of arrival and sort of greater prominence of a group of people here in the U.S., but it's also caught up in foreign policy issues. And I don't see any of the foreign policy issues that are the most, that I think are at the base of this going away anytime soon. So I think that there are forces at work here. I think the sheriff's advice about being close to other communities is a really important one, and I think that does make a difference here. I think there are possibilities for trying to reduce some of that, but I don't think that the foreign policy issues that this feeds off of and that are then also used to try and purvey hate, those aren't going to go away. So you're going to, it's a little bit different situation, I think.
Any other comments from the panel? I know that there's still a few questions left.
Why don't we take one more?
All right, we'll take two more. From here.
I really appreciate this dialogue committee and what you put together your time. And my name is Steve from Watts, California, and I'm in the academia, and lots of crime and lots of poverty. But my question is, are we going to allow, or I hope we don't allow our government to be hijacked in the way that the minority of people have shown an appearance of hijacking the religion about Islam. I hope that our government is not hijacked by a minority of legislators who are around the country spreading things like the Sharia, anti-Sharia. What do you think we should do with that?
Vote. I mean, I actually wanted to make a comment about the trajectory of bigotry and racism that other groups have experienced and juxtaposing that with the Muslim American experience. Islam has been practiced on this continent before this country was founded. And I think a lot of people in this room do not realize that, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Up to 30% of the slaves that were brought from the continent of Africa to the United States were Muslim. They spoke Arabic, they read the Quran, they practiced Islam on this soil. They built the capital, they built Washington D.C. They created an agricultural economy in the South that allowed the Civil War to emerge and for the U.S. to become the superpower that it has. So Islam has been practiced in this country long before any of us were born, before our grandparents were born, and before this country was founded and had its first president. So Islam is not a young religion in this country. And I think the first people that need to be cognizant of that is the Muslims in this room. It's very difficult to expect this country to accept that Islam is an integral part of the society if we ourselves don't know the history of our existence on this continent. And one slight disagreement or clarification. I think that assimilation is good if it's a choice, but I think integration is a fundamental principle of being an American. I think that integration allows for common values between a person's background, whether it's ethnic, religious, or cultural, to be manifested and a nexus to be performed with the country in which they live. In this case, it's the United States of America. Islam and democracy are compatible. We're seeing that around the world. And Muslims need to manifest that themselves. That doesn't mean that we need to shed ourselves of our Islamic identity or our Islamic process in order to be accepted. I agree that diversity is what protects people. And creating a diverse cross-section between whether it's interfaith groups. I did a 6-month Muslim-Jewish fellowship last year, which taught me just as much about myself as it did about Judaism. I think those things are important, but I don't think it should be at the expense of who we see in the mirror and how we choose to define ourselves. So that's just one point that I wanted to make, because I think that we often think of Islam as an immigrant religion in this country that was brought here post-World War II from the Arab world and from South Asia, and everyone's Arab or Pakistani that's Muslim in this country. And that doesn't show respect or deference to the multiple generations of Muslims that didn't practice the Nation of Islam, that practice Sunni Orthodoxy Islam in the African American community. So I just wanted to make that one point. One more question.
Hi, everybody. My name is Birpal Kaur. I'm actually here representing the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I absolutely would love to thank all the panelists and the fact that there's such a great audience here on me today. That's awesome. My question / comment is to address one of the statements that was made earlier on the panel about the concept of invalidating fear and how certain experiences, if we look at even just the post-9/11 last decade for our community, for the Muslim American community, which is the context everyone was talking in. I'd like to really point out something that I feel like is really obvious, but may or may not be. But when we're talking about the radicalization of the Muslim American community, that does not just affect the Muslim American community. It is something that absolutely affects a larger South Asian context and beyond. And so when we talk about the concept of fear and how it affects our lifestyles and our quality of life, and we're talking about Representative King and the King hearings, and all this got a lot of media attention. But what I would like to hear from hopefully maybe the professors sitting up here is when we have elected officials that are adamant on portraying what is a message of hate. We have what the King hearings kind of brought out. There was a lot of movement, I think, within a lot of the different communities, which was fantastic. But at the same time, the backlash that absolutely happened within the state of California, a lot of the Sikh American community once again felt. Over the last 6 months, we've had 5 extremely violent hate crimes happen just in our state alone, 3 of which have ended in death. So when we're talking about the invalidation of fear and really trying to bring those broader concepts together, I appreciate that, but I feel as if it's not manifested through our political leadership, as well as maybe some of the sentiment as we're discussing these issues. So if I could get some commentary and feedback on that, that's what I appreciate.
I didn't remember hearing somebody saying invalidating fear. I mean, we have a political system that allows citizens to vote, and we don't give out citizenship based on any sort of qualifications of understanding the issues or being well educated or anything like that. So we basically get representatives who are a product of those who choose to exercise the franchise. And I mean, we have a system, particularly, I think, and perhaps Professor O'Leary can talk a little bit more about the media aspect of it, but the need to be reelected, to attract attention, to attract funds to be reelected, will lead those who are more opportunistic and less moral to become these kinds of entrepreneurs of hate, in some cases, just frankly. I don't, aside from then working as much as we can as citizens to make sure that these people are not reelected, I mean, really not. I mean, I think what this really calls out for is civic engagement and a refusal to be intimidated. Now, I understand. I mean, I'm not a member of a minority ethnic community, so I've not suffered that kind of marginalization, that kind of intimidation. It's very easy for me to say you should stand up. You should, but there are groups that are willing to partner with groups that are being, against whom attempts of intimidation are being made, and I think that's also part of what the sheriff was talking about before in this sort of strength and diversity. I mean, I think that is one of the strengths of the American system, that there are others. It's not just because I happen to be of a particular ethnic group, I'm only interested in my own ethnicity. People who have suffered during earlier waves of these kinds of things that understand. I mean, the Japanese American community, primary among them, right? I don't know.
I think one thing to clarify in what you were saying is that there does need to be an acknowledgement that South Asian communities that are not Muslim are negatively impacted by the racialization of Muslims as the other. I think that's a fundamental thing that needs to be acknowledged. So Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, anyone that's South Asian and sort of brown, Christians. I mean, that's the thing. Like Coptics in the Arab world, and so it's just that this otherization, although it has occurred in the past, I don't think it's been as diverse. I think this is the most diverse racialization and otherization that's ever occurred in the history of the planet. So how we delve into that is twofold: intra and inter. I think these communities, these faith communities that are being marginalized together, need to show solidarity. And I think that the students on this campus do an excellent job of doing that in terms of the Hindu and Muslim students in particular, and there needs to be more outreach to Sikh students and Jain students. But I think that also for people in a position of power, there needs to be an acknowledgement that this grouping happens, unfortunately, organically, and it's based on physical appearance, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the ideology or theology, and that there needs to be a segregation of the issue from this entire group of people that have absolutely nothing to do with what's being pushed forward. I think the first people that were attacked and experienced hate crimes after 9/11 were actually Sikhs. They were not Muslims.
I would actually like to interrupt you as well and add something today that we just found out. Governor Brewer is sitting on a bill today to sign that, to take off Balbir Soji. He was the first victim after 9/11 that was declared a victim of a hate crime. And immediately, it was, I mean, the guy that's convicted is sitting in jail under a conviction of a hate crime, and they want to take his name off of the memorial plaque because he is not considered a victim of 9/11. So when we talk about elected officials and kind of that sentiment, as well as pushing that sentiment forward, that's really what we're dealing with. Like, this just happened today. What have we been talking about right afterward? You know, and there absolutely has been a lot of work as far as the nature of collaboration into organizations and other agencies. It's absolutely something that we participate in. And so I'd kind of like to just add that to the mix.
Can I give a little answer to your point as well? When we talk about South Asian society, you know, no matter which part of the world society exists, there are strata. Not everyone is all the same within the same society. And where I challenge students to be is that you have to reach out beyond your professed major and get into the reality of saying, I want to build a better community within my ethnicity or my faith, or I want to build it beyond it. And it's that building it beyond it that I think is very important. I have interfaith council, and I have Sikhs. I even have a Sikh deputy sheriff. We're part of your... And it's a very important thing to have the Muslims in my department, because the more you see authority figures of your particular ethnicity, religion, or nationality, for that matter, historical nationality from other countries, it shows that you are a part of a structure that you can trust. And I believe that you're strong, and I think that I heard you in a different way because I can do something about what you've said. And so the context of public safety is not just to say, catch the crook. It's to address the fears of a society and to do it coactively as opposed to any other way. And I thank you.
I think with that we're going to wrap up, and I have a few closing remarks, and then I also want to go through all 21 students that actually put this event together and acknowledge them. I think that when this panel was first proposed to me by students, I was actually pretty upset with what they said. They said that we were afraid that if we put a Muslim panelist on this panel, the panel itself would lose credibility and objectivity. And that was indicative of the state of my students, that they feel that if they have a Muslim attorney or a Muslim professor or a Muslim law enforcement official or a Muslim that deals with counterterrorism, that the panel would be somehow invalidated and it wouldn't be perceived as objective. So we constructed this panel with that mindset. And that told me much more about the impact of the radicalization hearings than anything else. And it was very depressing. But I saw it as an opportunity. And that opportunity and the way that I kind of flipped the way that they were presenting the panel is that the people on this panel have a variety of expertise and provide multiple vantage points from a position of authority, whether it be academia, trends in the media, law enforcement, or counterterrorism. And there's few times that Muslims in particular take the opportunity to hold people like this to task. And this panel was an opportunity to hear publicly from these people in a position of power and to really answer the needs and the concerns of the Muslims on this campus and in this city. And I applaud the panel for rising to that challenge. And I hope that in the future that Muslims and non-Muslims and South Asians can be seen as equally credible. And that over an extended period of time, as they develop their expertise in areas of policy, in law enforcement, and in arenas of legal endeavors, that they can speak as an authoritative person without any appearance of impropriety or lack of objectivity. So please join me in thanking the panel one more time. I'd like to thank the following students: Nabil Alam, Sana Azam, Sana Shuja, Taha Sayed, Raza Bakai, Saud Siddiqui, Murtaza Razavi, Nashwa Akhtar, Danielle Khan, Omar Merchant, Kieran Alvi, Sophia Khan, Akifa Khan, Lukman Ismail, Faria Kalam, Sarah Shahawi, Wajiha Shakil, Adil Muhammadi, Rami Rashad, Samar Rashad, and Ifra Sheikh. Thank you very much for coming. I'd appreciate it if you could check out the Office of Religious Life website, the Asian Pacific American Student Services website, and the USCMuslims.com site. Thank you.